Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Conducted from 1932 to 1972, it remains a stark reminder of medical racism and ethical misconduct. 600 African-American men, mostly impoverished sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama, were lured with promises of free medical care. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a term for various ailments. The true aim? To observe the natural progression of syphilis even as effective treatment became available. These men became victims of a system that devalued their lives and disregarded their basic human rights. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study serves as a chilling reminder of the potential for scientific progress to be twisted into a tool of oppression. The echoes of this experiment urge us to confront the dark chapters of medical history and champion ethical practices. The year was 1932. The Great Depression had cast a long shadow over America, hitting the African-American community in the South particularly hard. In Macon County, Alabama, the promise of free medical care was like a beacon of hope. The U.S. Public Health Service began recruiting participants for the Tuskegee study. The researchers, all white, offered free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance. They told the men they were being treated for bad blood, concealing the true nature of the study. The men were never told they had syphilis. This deliberate withholding of information constituted a gross violation of their informed consent. The promise of free medical care became a cruel bait-and-switch tactic. The men, unaware of the experiment, became unwitting subjects in a study that would scar their lives and leave an indelible stain on medical history. In the early 20th century, syphilis cast a long and terrifying shadow over America. Its impact was especially severe in impoverished African-American communities. The U.S. Public Health Service launched the Tuskegee Study to study syphilis's natural progression. The men recruited, predominantly illiterate sharecroppers, became unwitting subjects in a medical drama that would unfold over 4 decades. The researchers, blinded by their scientific ambitions, failed to see the men as human beings deserving of respect and dignity. The selection of Macon County, Alabama, as the location for the Tuskegee study was no coincidence. The county's predominantly African-American population and high poverty rate provided fertile ground for exploitation. The promise of free medical care was too tempting to resist. The researchers, exploiting socioeconomic disparities, preyed on the men's desperation. The study, conceived in an era marked by segregation and discrimination, reflected the deep-seated racism that permeated American society. Who were these men? They were farmers, laborers, and sharecroppers, the backbone of Macon County's agricultural economy. Fathers, husbands, and sons, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the rural South. Bound by their shared history and hardships, they unknowingly walked into a medical nightmare. Their trust in the medical establishment would prove to be a grave miscalculation. They believed in the promise of free medical care, unaware it was a cruel facade concealing a sinister experiment. The offer of free medical care was, in reality, a poisoned gift. The men were subjected to a battery of medical tests and procedures under the guise of receiving health care. Spinal taps, labeled as back treatments, were performed without anesthesia, inflicting excruciating pain. The men were never told they had syphilis, nor informed of the potential consequences of leaving the disease untreated. The researchers, driven by a perverse curiosity, prioritized their scientific goals over the well-being of their subjects. The Tuskegee study, cloaked in the guise of medical benevolence, was a cruel charade. For 40 years, the men of Macon County were subjected to a medical regimen devoid of any real therapeutic value. The men, their trust misplaced, endured painful and unnecessary procedures believing they were receiving the best medical care. The researchers, their notebooks filled with clinical observations, seemed indifferent to the human cost of their experiment. The men, their bodies slowly succumbing to syphilis, were kept in the dark about their true condition. As the years turned into decades, the deception at the heart of the Tuskegee study deepened. Even as penicillin emerged as an effective treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, the researchers deliberately withheld this life-saving drug. The men, their bodies weakened by the disease, were denied access to the medication that could have alleviated their suffering. The researchers went to great lengths to ensure the men did not receive treatment from other sources. The men, trapped in a web of deceit and medical neglect, were left to suffer the consequences of a disease that was entirely preventable. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study casts a long shadow over the history of medicine, its legacy one of profound mistrust and betrayal. The study's revelations in 1972 exposed the dark underbelly of scientific ambition and racism in medical research. The men of Macon County became powerful symbols of medical exploitation. The Tuskegee study forced a long overdue reckoning with the ethical dimensions of medical research, leading to significant reforms. The legacy of Tuskegee continues to resonate today, underscoring the need for constant vigilance and safeguarding the rights of research participants. The year was 1965. In a government office in San Francisco, a young venereal disease investigator named Peter Buxton stumbled upon a dark secret. As Buxton delved into the archives, he discovered the Tuskegee study, ongoing since 1932. The men, diagnosed with syphilis, were being denied treatment, even after penicillin became widely available. Driven by a sense of duty and justice, Buxton resolved to expose the study and end the suffering of the men in Macon County. Armed with moral conviction, Peter Buxton approached his superiors at the U.S. Public Health Service. To his dismay, he was met with resistance, his concerns dismissed as naive idealism. The officials, their careers intertwined with the study, were unwilling to acknowledge the ethical quagmire. Buxton, undeterred, continued to voice his concerns, writing memos and seeking allies. He contacted medical ethicists, legal experts, and journalists, hoping to break through the wall of silence. His efforts, though noble, seemed to be in vain. Frustrated by the lack of action, Peter Buxton knew he had to find another way to expose the Tuskegee study. In 1966, he reached out to a reporter friend, Edith Lederer, sharing the horrifying details. Lederer, recognizing the explosive nature of the story, passed the information to Jean Heller, a seasoned investigative reporter. Heller began to investigate, interviewing sources and reviewing documents. She pieced together the complex web of deceit that had sustained the Tuskegee study for over 4 decades. The stage was set for the exposure of one of America's most infamous medical scandals. On July 25, 1972, the front page of the Washington Star carried a headline that sent shockwaves across America. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. Jean Heller's meticulously researched expose laid bare the horrifying truth of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, revealing the depths of deception and medical abuse inflicted upon hundreds of African American men. The article, a damning indictment of government-sanctioned racism and medical misconduct, sparked outrage and disbelief across the nation. The public, appalled by the revelations, demanded answers. Civil rights leaders condemned the study as a monstrous act of racial injustice. Politicians, shamed by the exposure, called for investigations and reforms. The U.S. Public Health Service, once a symbol of medical authority, was now at the center of a national scandal. In the wake of the expose, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was swiftly shut down. The men, their lives forever scarred by the experiment, were finally offered treatment, although for many it was too late to reverse the damage that had been done. The study's legacy, however, would continue to haunt the nation, forcing a long overdue reckoning with the ethical boundaries of medical research and the insidious ways in which racism can infect scientific inquiry. The public's response to the Tuskegee Syphilis Study's expose was immediate and visceral. A collective gasp of horror rippled across the nation as the news spread like wildfire. Jean Heller's article in the Washington Star, a beacon of truth in a sea of deceit, had pierced the veil of secrecy surrounding the study, revealing a medical nightmare fueled by racism and indifference. The article's graphic details of medical neglect, deliberate deception, and the exploitation of a vulnerable population ignited a firestorm of outrage. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, their front pages filled with images of the study's victims, elderly black men, their faces etched with the pain and betrayal inflicted upon them by their own government. The public outcry was deafening. Civil rights organizations, their voices amplified by years of battling against racial injustice, denounced the study as a monstrous act of medical apartheid. Church leaders, their pulpits transformed into platforms for moral outrage, condemned the study as a sin against God and humanity. Ordinary citizens, their sense of justice shaken to the core, flooded the halls of Congress with letters and telegrams demanding accountability and reform. The weight of the nation's anger fell heavily on the U.S. Public Health Service. Once a revered institution entrusted with safeguarding the nation's health, it was now branded with the mark of shame. The study's architects and those who had perpetuated its existence for 4 decades faced a barrage of accusations and investigations. Congressional hearings were convened, their chambers transformed into tribunals, where the study's architects were forced to defend the indefensible. The nation watched in disbelief as doctors and scientists, their faces now etched with fear and remorse, struggled to explain how they had allowed such a horrific experiment to continue for so long. The price of their silence, maintained for decades to protect their careers and reputations, was now coming due. The study's victims, their voices once silenced by fear and powerlessness, were now given a platform to share their stories of pain, betrayal, and resilience. Their testimonies, filled with a quiet dignity that belied the horrors they had endured, exposed the human cost of the study's scientific ambitions. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, a horrific chapter in American medical history, became an unexpected catalyst for change. Public outrage forced a reckoning with the ethical dimensions of medical research. The study's legacy, intertwined with racism and medical abuse, warned against unchecked scientific ambition. Landmark reforms were enacted to prevent such atrocities. The National Research Act of 1974 established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. The Belmont Report outlined principles of respect, beneficence, and justice. The Tuskegee study sowed the seeds for a more ethical approach to research. The public's demand for justice in the wake of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study's exposure was undeniable. The nation recognized the study as a blatant manifestation of systemic racism within the medical establishment. The idea that a government agency could exploit and endanger the lives of its own citizens sparked widespread calls for accountability and reparations. The surviving participants became powerful symbols of resilience and a stark reminder of the human cost of medical abuse. They deserved not only an apology, but also tangible recognition of the suffering they had endured. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed, alleging that the U.S. government had violated their constitutional rights. The lawsuit sought financial compensation for the harm inflicted upon the men and their loved ones. The government agreed to an out-of-court settlement in 1974. The settlement, totaling $10 million, provided financial compensation to the surviving participants and the families of those who had died. While the settlement could never erase the pain, it represented a symbolic acknowledgement of the government's wrongdoing and a commitment to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, though officially concluded in 1972, continues to cast a long shadow over the landscape of medical research. Its legacy, etched in the collective memory of the nation, serves as a stark reminder of the potential for scientific ambition to be twisted into a tool of oppression, particularly when directed at marginalized communities. The study's echoes can be heard in contemporary debates about health disparities, medical mistrust, and the ethics of research involving vulnerable populations. The study's revelations exposed the deep-seated racism that permeated the American medical establishment, a legacy that continues to influence healthcare access and outcomes for communities of color today. The mistrust sowed by the Tuskegee study, passed down through generations, contributes to the hesitancy among some minority groups to participate in medical research and to seek healthcare in general. Overcoming this legacy of mistrust requires sustained effort from the medical community, to rebuild trust with communities that have been historically marginalized and abused. It demands a commitment to diversity and inclusion within the ranks of medical professionals, ensuring that healthcare providers reflect the communities they serve. It necessitates a paradigm shift in medical research, one that prioritizes community engagement, informed consent, and transparency, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study stands as a chilling reminder of the fragility of trust in science and society. It underscores the immense responsibility of researchers and institutions in safeguarding participants' well-being. The ethical lapses of the Tuskegee study warn against unchecked power and prejudice. Lessons from this dark chapter have shaped a new era of research ethics. Informed consent ensures individuals are fully informed, and their participation is voluntary. IRBs provide independent oversight, ensuring studies meet ethical standards. These safeguards, hard won through suffering, guide scientific inquiry with ethical principles.